The number of starving people around the world is falling. A rare bit of good news on World Food Day. But is achieving sustainable food security possible? And what does it really take to feed the hungry? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It seems there are fewer mouths to feed in the world, but the figure for starving people is still staggering: 827 million in the developing world. Nourishment and the lack of it is the backdrop to the World Food Day being celebrated. But there's little to be thankful for in parts of Africa as they experience the worst drought in decades. About 1.5 million people in southern Angola and more than 778,000 in northern Namibia do not have enough food or water. According to the UN, if nothing is done, severe famine is on its way. For others in Africa and other parts of the world, undernourishment is already a reality. This is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's hunger map for 2013. The most undernourished countries are highlighted in dark red. In Africa, Zambia, Mozambique and Ethiopia are of the biggest concern. But there's incomplete data for places like Sudan and Somalia, which also suffer from food insecurity. Crossing over to Asia, and the map picks out Laos and North Korea as some of the most undernourished countries there. And even India, with its population of more than 1.2 billion, has a major issue with food security. However, it's not all bad news. The figures show that the number of hungry people around the world is falling. Between 2011 and 2013, a total of 827 million people were hungry in developing nations. That number has fallen by 169 million in the last 20 years. More than 60 countries have reached or are expected to reach their Millennium Development Hunger targets. And the Global Hunger Index released this week shows that overall, Sub-Saharan Africa has a better score than South Asia. And that's a twist on the thinking that Africa has the worst levels of hunger and a show of progress for the continent. Let's bring in our guests then. In Rome, Alexandre Mebach from the Food and Agriculture Organization. In Oxford, John Bennett, author and specialist on the modern challenges of food security. And joining us from London, Heidi Chow, who is a food justice campaigner focused on the funding of food. Thank you very much for being with us, all of you. Alexandre, it's not often we can start off with good news, so let's do just that. According to the Global Hunger Index, the number of people starving is falling. What do you think is behind that?
First of all, at this certain stage, 1 or 2 years ago, the estimates we used, how would I say it? Some of the figures which have been released 1 or 2 years ago were a bit higher than the reality which has been finally accounted for. So that's an important point to keep in mind. Then a lot of countries have done very big progress in reducing the number of hungry people, as you summarized in your introduction. So these are, of course, very good news, and it's especially a reason to do more because, as you have said, there are still more than 800 hungry people. And also, one should not forget that there are more than 2 billion people who are malnourished, not necessarily undernourished, but lacking essential micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals which are absolutely essential for good health, and it's especially important for children. So it's not only the global figures of hunger to keep in mind, but also what is called hidden hunger, people who are not fed as they need to be.
Okay. John, you've spent a lot of time researching and filming this subject, poverty and hunger. These decreasing numbers, I mean, Alexandre seemed to suggest that there was maybe a bit of tweaking needed in the actual numbers to get them correct. But what is it that you've seen from your experience?
Well, I think one thing we have to understand is that there's a shifting demographic issue here. 50 years ago, many of the poor people in the world would be in rural areas, and during food shortages, they wouldn't be susceptible to prices of food prices, because of course they'd be self-sufficient in some respects. And what's happened over the last 50 years has been a shift in population towards urban areas. So now 50% of the world's population live in urban areas, which means that they no longer depend on their own production of food, but rather on buying food. And once you get into that economic issue, you're talking about whether people can afford to buy their food rather than simply to grow it themselves. And then they become very susceptible to rising food prices. And this is one of the major issues that we're facing at the moment, is growing malnutrition among the urban populations, particularly the poorer populations. And food insecurity, as Alexander mentioned, is not just a matter of shortage in quantity, but also quality. It's what you eat that determines the micronutrient issues.
Okay, let's stick with that, John. If I may jump in here.
Yeah.
Describe to us what you feel is essential, or what you know to be essential to have the appropriate diet in order for you to grow properly, in order for you to function, in order for you to live. What is it?
Well, in the first 2 years of life, you have to have a balance of the right nutrients within the diet. One of the problems at the moment is that many of the kind of foodstuffs that people are eating are not sufficient for that. So we have, for example, very high incidence of vitamin A deficiency in children up to the age of 2 years old. Once you've got that, you have a long-term issue of stunting, and also issues of learning ability, etc. So in some countries where you wouldn't necessarily see malnourished children, or you may not recognize malnourished children, what you actually have is this chronic long-term stunting issue, which can have a knock-on effect for years and years, right the way through until adult.
Heidi, so what we have here is not the right type of food possibly getting to people, or certainly food that doesn't have enough nutrients, and the fact that so many people are moving to cities and out of urban areas. What role does the increase in food prices have in this big scenario?
Yeah, so I think John's touched on a really important point here about rising food prices. Over the last few years, we've been at the World Development Movement, we've been trying to campaign to try and regulate financial markets, because we're seeing that one of the drivers behind high food prices, as well as food price volatility, is the introduction of more and more financial players, investment banks, coming into financial markets and dominating them and speculating on food prices. So we've been trying to get regulation introduced at the EU level to try and prevent these financial actors from playing this kind of role in the markets. Because
is
you're
there
right,
a
the
desire,
food price
excuse
rises,
me, jumping in again, from a government level to put a stop to this, or are they working in cahoots?
Yeah, so the EU actually on the cusp of introducing some effective new measures to tackle this. But the UK government only just this week, that we heard that they were playing a major obstacle in getting this new effective regulation introduced. So this is happening right now. We're talking about sustainable food security. Actually, a lot of the things that we will discuss, I guess, in this discussion will be more longer term, slightly more bigger picture things. But actually, this piece of regulation is, like I said, on the verge of happening. This autumn, they'll be concluding these negotiations, and we really want to see the UK government get behind them rather than be an obstacle to them. And that's something that can really make a real difference in terms of food price rises and high food prices that a lot of communities are facing in developing countries.
Maybe you could add to that, Alexandre. I know one of your specialities is about regulation underway.
Yeah, maybe just to recall that Even though the percentage of the urban population is increasing, there are still, the majority of the poor are still in rural areas, and the rural population is still increasing, even if it's increasing in less quickly than in urban areas, especially in some countries. And rural population also has to buy food, but they are somehow more distant from both the economics and political institutions which can make them have this food. So to a great extent, high prices also, or more, not high prices, very volatile price, because this is more the issue than being high in themselves, also impact poor rural people. Then coming back to price volatility and high prices in general, there are lots of causes to price volatility, and some of them are increased by others, which means that there is not a single solution to high prices or to high volatility. There is a need for more coordination, because it is an ongoing discussion that we need to have at international level on how to coordinate policies in order to limit food price volatility and to be able to act when there is a problem. Which is why the international community has created AMIS, which is a tool to observe the movements of food production, of stocks, of demand, in order to be able to better prevent the types of crises which make these violent increases of prices, and to be able to take measures when it's still the moment to do it. Then it is true that, of course, speculation will aggravate these kind of fluctuation of prices, because to a great extent this is exactly what speculation is about. So it is an element of it, but there are also lots of other causes, which can be climatic shocks. In 2008, some countries stopped trade, prevented exports, which of course had impacts on other countries. So it's very much also a question of how the various countries react together and coordinate their policies.
What about, John, taking it down to the ground? What about building stakeholders? What about getting the women who are most affected by this more involved in the development, possibly owning the land that so many of them toil?
Well, that's true. I mean, one of the key issues here is allowing poor farmers and poor rural dwellers to have some kind of control over their own resources. One of the chief ways in which you can do this, of course, is to collectivize people. In other words, to encourage collective farming, to encourage farmers' associations, women's associations, so that they can have some degree of control over the pricing of their produce. One of the problems at the moment is that the larger companies are, in a sense, picking the farmers off and paying them price which is far below the actual value of their produce. And they're extremely vulnerable to this. And the only way to counter this is to encourage those farmers to come together collectively to counter that kind of price
The sort of cooperative
control that is in. Yes, exactly. But also, and probably equally important, is to invest in the marketing systems themselves, in what we'd normally call the value chain, which is to ensure that there is an easy way in which farmers can have access to markets, and that those local markets then can have easy access to national markets. So it's all the way up the chain, in a sense, that we have to invest in infrastructure, we have to invest in areas that enable those farmers to get fair prices for their produce. I was recently in Yemen, for example, where I was looking at actually fish producers, they're local fishermen, and their biggest problem was that they took the fish out of the sea, they then didn't have the very basic things like refrigeration to enable them to send those fish to the local market at the nearest town. So something as simple as that was actually an impediment to them receiving a decent wage for their labour.
How do you seem to be agreeing with what was said there? And I suppose it's a case of giving the power back to the people, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I think John's touched on a really important point in that we have a global food system which is dominated by multinationals. And there is enough food in the world to feed everyone on this planet. But what we're seeing is, as you mentioned earlier at the beginning of your piece, we have just under 1 billion people who are hungry. We also have over 1 billion people who are classified overweight or obese. And at the heart of this global corporatized global food system is a small number of multinationals who are controlling agriculture at all the various different levels, from inputs to seeds to chemicals. We've been advocating for and supporting the global movement for food sovereignty, which is about the right for people to define their own food systems. It's about handing back control of the food system back to the people who consume food, who produce food, to produce food that is for consumption, essentially, that is healthy and culturally appropriate, but also that it's produced in a way that is ecologically sustainable and that values the food producers and especially female food producers, who we know are, take a very big role in producing food. So we do want to see, we want to support this global movement, which is, like you said, handing power of the control of the food system back to the people who produce food and consume food as well.
And with the world's population expected to be over 9 billion by 2050 and much of the planet's arable land already in use, inventors are thinking of new ways to meet food shortages. Take this radical new farming technique, the vertical farm. This one in Singapore is able to produce a ton of fresh vegetables every other day. Its water supply is recycled and all the waste on the farm is composted and reused. With more of us moving to urban centres, as was confirmed by our guests, entrepreneurs have started making use of a somewhat overlooked part of our cities, our rooftops. And our appetite for fish has led to the growth of the artificial farm. There was concern about raising seafood outside the natural habitat. The solution, a floating fish farm. John, in your explorations, what sort of sustainable methods have you become aware of that could be rolled out?
Well, I can choose a couple of examples. I mean, for instance, the production of cocoa beans. The cocoa pulp, for example, can be used for growing mushrooms. We can use what is the leftover, if you like, from some of the cash crops. We can feed it back into the agricultural system, and this is a relatively simple technology that can be promoted. Not only obviously for cocoa, but other produce as well. It's extraordinary that something in the region of 150 kilograms of food per person per year in developing countries is actually wasted.
An extraordinary,
and yet here we have this. This is an extraordinary figure, considering that you have systems now, technologies, for reusing that waste. As fertilizer, etc., rather than paying very, very high prices for commercial fertilizers. And again, it's a matter of using simple technologies and enabling people to have access to those technologies so that they can actually reuse some of the waste produce as well as obviously getting the benefits from their own produce.
Okay, Alexander, what are your thoughts on this? What would a sustainable food system look like for you?
First of all, a sustainable food system is a system who enable everybody to meet its nutritional needs now and in the future. And this is precisely why we have to think on the long term, because natural resources are finite, and according to FAO, will need to produce 60% more food towards 2050 to address a growing demand of a growing population and a richer population. So it means, precisely as it has been said, that we have to manage much better all the resources we're using to produce food. Just
And sorry,
to give
as
an
you say,
example,
a richer population, sorry, I mean, you've got so many more people moving up the food chain, something like 3 billion people. That must make quite an impact.
Yeah. Globally, population is going to increase by 30%, and the demand for food is going to increase by 60%, because people some people will be richer, they will eat more, and moreover, they will eat more livestock products, and livestock needs more calories to grow. You need more calories to make a calorie of meat than to make a calorie of cereals. And right now, we are losing along the food chain, or wasting at consumer level, 1/3 of the food which is produced worldwide. This gives just an example of the fact that our systems are not efficient. We're losing nutrients, we're losing natural resources all along the process. Of course, we cannot reduce it to zero, but the objective has to be to reduce food losses and waste to zero if we want to have sustainable food systems and to have them being able to feed the population in the future. So we have to be much more aware and cautious all along the food system, which are getting more and more global, from production to consumption.
Heidi, what role for the money man and woman in the sustainable picture, other than more trade than aid, for example?
Yeah, I think we need to direct more support to small-scale farmers, to peasant agriculture, because these small-scale producers are actually already feeding 70% of the world's population. So we need to give them much more support, and which would not just help them to develop more sustainable methods of farming. So, for example, using more agroecology, which is using nature rather than working against nature, but also to reduce, for example, the distance between producers and consumers, because actually, if we want a truly sustainable food system, we need to address the fact that a lot of our food travels millions of, thousands of miles to get to where the consumers are. And actually, if we could reduce that and get producers actually feeding the communities where they're at, we'd also address things like climate change and waste and packaging and so on. So actually, we need to be able to support the smaller scale producers who are already feeding the world, but we'd need more support to help them in terms of researching these agroecological methods and supporting them in being able to produce food sustainably and locally.
John, the UN is pinpointing bugs as the next big protein. They're trying to get business to get all excited about that. What do you think that somebody like me or you could do on a small level to try and make this whole situation a lot more acceptable, to help those who are starving?
Well, I think one thing we haven't mentioned yet, although Heidi did mention climate change, is the biggest threat at the moment to food security is the access to water. Many of the countries we're talking about are either on the margins, if you like, of desert areas, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa. We've got situations in countries like Yemen where aquifers, that means wells, are being dug deeper and deeper and deeper to extract water, which is just not sustainable at all, and using water perhaps in a wrong manner. What we really need to do is to start to develop very simple technologies that enable the use of well water to be targeted to plants rather than more generally distributed across the land. This kind of technology is available. It is quite expensive, but it's certainly worth investing in. And we need to address more directly this issue of water
Okay,
availability,
John,
because this
I'm
is going to
afraid
increase.
Let's leave it with that word of warning from John Bennett. And thanks very much to my other guests, too, Alexandre Mebek and Heidi Cha. And thank you very much for joining us in this edition of Inside Story. If you'd like, you can send us your feedback. Email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching from me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team. Bye-bye.